Okay, here we go. Our brand new mini lecture for Module 1B in our second week of study for the English 037 class in the 2020 intersession. Okay, we are moving on to sentences level 3. So we're looking at 3 more types of sentences that are different or new when considering the list of 7 sentences that we've already learned. So we've learned simple, compound, complex A, complex B. We've learned academic. We've learned compound complex and complex compound sentences. Those are all of the previous types in sentences 1.0 and sentences 2.0. So now we're moving on to 3.0. So the first type of clause that we're going to talk about is that clauses. Now these are clauses that start with the word that. They have a technical grammatical name, which is the restrictive relative clause. Now what this means is when you start a clause within a sentence with the marker that, it is essential information. Okay, you can't remove it from the sentence without destroying the sentence in essence. So it is essential. So that's why we call it a restrictive clause. It's because it restricts the grammar and correct, accurate meaning of the sentence. So let's take a look at it. So number one, that clauses essentially allow a writer to bury a new idea or clause within an existing sentence. So this is a way for you to add in more information. You're burying a new idea within your existing sentence. And usually you'll have your subject, your verb, then you'll have your that clause. It plugs in. So we can look at our formula. Formula basically is C1, so that would be the existing idea, the start of your first clause, which would be your subject and your main verb. Then you have the that plus C2, so that second clause gets buried right within the original structure. So let's take a look. The students were surprised that a new sentence structure existed. So you can see that we've got it color coded here. Yellow equals the initial clause. That is the restrictive relative clause marker. It's a type of linking word. And then we've got the new idea, a new sentence. So sentence is the subject, or sorry, sentence structure. So structure would be the subject noun here, and then existed is the verb. Okay, so I've basically done this job for you. What are the nouns or subject nouns and verbs within this sentence? So the first subject noun would be, correct, students. And the first main verb would be, were surprised. Good. The second subject noun would be, a new sentence structure. The whole thing together is the noun phrase. The actual noun itself would be structure. And then is an article, new and sentence are adjectives describing what kind of structure we're talking about. And then the verb in that clause, in the that clause, would be existed. And both of these verbs are in what tense? Good, they're in the past tense. Ed marks past. Okay, so one thing for us to notice here is that we do not use a comma in this sentence. Because it is essential information, because it is a restrictive relative clause, we do not use a comma. Okay, so that same exact structure, which is the restrictive relative clause structure, there are other relative clause markers that we can use in the same way. So restrictive relative clauses, again, just to reiterate, they include essential information. So once you've added it, you can't take it away without destroying the grammar. So we'll call them RRC markers, restrictive relative clause markers. And here they are. Who, that, when, and where are all common in this category. Now this is not the entire list, there are more of them. If you want, I can add a list later as one of our documents for linking words. You know, we've already learned our coordinate conjunctions, for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So we've already talked about conjunctive adverbs, right? That's our whom tatania family. However, moreover, therefore, thus, nevertheless, in addition, and additionally. Just in the same way, there is a list of relative clause markers. These are 4 of the most common restrictive relative clause markers. So let's look at some examples here. So all of these are called relative pronouns, and they mark the start of your new clause, which you are burying within your original sentence or idea. So to write some sentences using these markers, I encourage you try to write some, and let's take a look. So number one, we discovered who was the best sentence writer. So now this one's quite interesting because actually in this additional piece of information, the restrictive relative clause, who was the best writer, you'll actually see that the relative clause marker is also acting as the subject. So that's totally, completely okay and allowed. Let's check the next one. Number two, the librarian decided when the common area would close. So these two examples are great examples because they show you in the first one, we're using the restrictive relative clause marker as the subject in our new clause, right? Who was the best sentence writer? It is who that is acting as the subject in that sentence or in that clause. But in the second example, when the common area would close, in this case, when is just acting as that linking word. And then we've got our subject would be the common area. That's the noun phrase that's acting as the subject. So it would be area as the noun, the as an article, common is an adjective describing what kind of area we have there. And you need to get comfortable working with noun phrases, guys. Get comfortable understanding that a noun phrase is quite often going to be in this exact structure where you have an article, then an adjective, and then a noun. All three of them together act as one powerful element within the sentence, which is driving that sentence, driving the action. So we have the common area is our subject here, and would close is the noun. So both of those words together make up the predicate. Okay, so you're going to see very quickly that these types of sentences will allow us to empower our writing. They allow us to add new information into a sentence, and they are called relative restrictive clauses. Okay, so our second type of new structure that we're talking about today is it's the other side of this relationship. So relative clauses, there's two types. There's a restrictive relative clause and a non-restrictive relative clause. And the non-restrictive relative clause is always started by comma, which. So I call these comma, which clauses. So unlike that clauses, which clauses add additional information. It's not essential, it's additional. Therefore, these clauses are offset with a comma. So that clauses and all of our restrictive relative clauses that start with those other markers, right? That, who, when, where, they don't need a comma. When you're using which, you need to use a comma. Okay, let's take a look at our example here. Desmond drove like a maniac, comma, which was a real surprise because he was normally cautious. So in this case, which is acting as the subject, and then we've got was is the main verb. A real surprise is it's kind of acting like an object here. It's part of the predicate. Now we've got a complex be structure. We're starting a brand new clause that's headed by the subordinate conjunction because we've got our next subject, he, and then we've got was normally cautious. Normally, what type of word is normally? If you said adverb, you're bang on. It's ending in an ly, and it's describing kind of the frequency or the state of how cautious he was. Is this something that happens all the time? So it's talking about our frequency there. Okay, let's take a look at the next point here. Notice that if you remove the which clause from the sentence example above, that the first sentence still makes sense. And that's why we say that these types of non-restrictive relative clauses are additional information, or what we call non-essential. Right, if we were to just chop the sentence short after or before the start of our non-restrictive relative clause, our which clause, the sentence is still fine, right? Desmond drove like a maniac, period. No problem. It's a complete idea. All right, moving on. So this is the third type of new sentence, is what we call a list sentence. And there are three different ways that we can start a list. We've got colon, which is a punctuation mark, including, or such as. These are all ways for us to introduce to our reader, hey, I'm about to list off a whole bunch of things that are in the same group or same category. So we often need to write sentences with lists after the verb, semicolon. These are called list sentences. Okay, there are three ways to introduce lists, and I'm kind of being a bit cheeky here because I've actually shown you the first one, which is to use a colon. So colon, using a colon, comma, using the Q including, or using the Q such as. So those three Qs set up the fact that we're going to list some stuff. So let's take a look here. The electric car has three advantages. So I've marked the linking element in red, colon, less fuel costs, comma, less maintenance fees, comma, and less impact on the environment. Now you'll notice that I've highlighted our second comma here, the one that comes before and, in green. And the reason I've done that is because I wanted to point out that in my class, for my sentences, I want a comma between every item in your list. We call this the Oxford comma. It's there's a big debate in writing whether or not we need to include this second comma in our list. For my class, in my system, the answer is yes. If you don't include it, you will suffer a slight deduction, minus 0.25, and I'll use the code Oxford comma, which is OX.C. Number 2, vampires have 3 core weaknesses, comma, including garlic, holy water, garlic, comma, holy water, comma, and sunlight. So you can choose to use a colon, or you can choose to use including with a comma in front of it. These both set up the fact that you're going to list off a bunch of things that are in the same category. And finally, example number 3, I proposed snacks for the party, comma, such as chips, dip, comma, and cola. So you see, again, all of my lists, I've got that green comma between item 2 and item 3 to indicate, hey, don't forget, I want you to include the Oxford comma. Great. Okay, so this is Sentences 3.0. Here is your practice assignment that goes along with this. I would like you to write 3 sentences that have that clauses. I would like you to write 3 sentences that have which clauses, and I would like you to write 3 sentences that are list sentences. So again, I would like 9 sentences to come out of this in terms of practice, showing me that, hey, I've got this idea on lockdown. Bit of a pun intended there. All right, guys, great work today. I hope you enjoyed this mini lecture, and we will see you on Wednesday.